Good evening. I know that you've had a long day, and we are here to make sure that you stay a bit longer. So it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Donna Weiss, and we're here to talk about an interesting topic that I'm sure you haven't heard before, and that is the challenges to the U.S. leadership in the Middle East. And I have a distinguished panel, which I'm sure you all know, so I will only refer to by name if that's okay with you. Ambassador Dennis Ross, Honorable Mary Beth Long, our own Ambassador Ron Prosor, and another former Ambassador Zalman Shoval. And I think we couldn't have asked for a better timing for this panel, and we have to thank Donald J. Trump with his reality instincts, because we are meeting here to talk about the role of the United States in the Middle East after the dramatic announcement yesterday at the White House. And I want to start by asking you, would we have had a different discussion today had the president waited till the date of the 12th of May and postponed his withdrawal for Saturday? Is this a real game changer? Is it going to change the American role in the Middle East? I want to start with Marianne, please.
Well, I hope it does. I mean, certainly how the president pursues what comes after the JCPOA and the withdrawal from that will be nested in, certainly in Iraq, Iran, Middle East broader plan, Turkey, all of it, a broader Middle East plan, which will be nested within our national security strategy. So I do think there's a certain amount of resetting that needs to go on in Washington that puts the context of this most recent decision in a broader U.S. policy that we'll see executed.
But when you look at it now, from what you've heard yesterday, do you believe that this is just a beginning of a greater role of the United States in the region? Is it going to assume its leadership dominance here? Or is it another way of it, at the end of the day, pivoting away?
I think in order to execute what the president wants to have happen, to contain Iran and deter it from a nuclear weapon, it will require an increased attention and an increased role in the region by the U.S., yes.
So, Ambassador Ross, by the way, were you surprised with the announcement yesterday? Did you think there would be another, it would be different in wording or in context?
Well, I've often said that I'm very humble when it comes to trying to predict what President Trump will do. In this particular case, I was surprised, not that he pulled out, I was surprised that he didn't create some degree of ambiguity. What I mean by that is, I thought he would go ahead and say, I'm no longer going to waive sanctions, but we're not going to implement these sanctions right now because the discussions we've had with the Europeans over the last several months have moved in a positive direction. The Europeans are now prepared to adopt sanctions as it relates to ballistic missile testing. The Europeans are now prepared to talk about imposing sanctions as it relates to imposing a higher cost on the Iranians for troublemaking in the region. The Europeans are prepared to at least explicitly say that military bases also have to be inspected within Iran. And we're still discussing what might be done in the sunset provision. So had he used the fact that they didn't want him to pull out as a lever, which he appeared to be doing before yesterday, then I felt that if he'd done this in a sort of ambiguous way, it allowed him to say, all right, this isn't good enough, but I'm giving you a little bit more time.
So what do you think happened?
I think what happened is that he actually wanted all along to pull out. He wasn't that interested in truth in using the leverage to get the kind of changes that he was talking about. Yes, he wanted the changes, but I think maybe he expected they would never really, the Europeans wouldn't be forthcoming. And he wanted to show that he could be tough and that he could pull out and he could challenge the whole foreign policy establishment that was suggesting he not do so, including the Republicans on Capitol Hill. I think he wanted to show again he could go his own way. I suspect also he thinks this is a way to signal Kim Jong-un, unless you meet my terms, you see what's going to happen.
So basically you're saying the issue was Iran yesterday, but in the background, or maybe in the front, was the more burning issue, and that would be North Korea.
Well, particularly because he's going to be seeing him soon. I do think, in a sense, he's trying to influence Kim Jong-un on what to expect, on how to approach him. I suspect that Kim Jong-un already has his own strategy in mind.
Ambassador Shoval, but in Israel, this was greeted with, almost a jubilee. It was something that is considered a great political victory for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and B, a great victory for Israel. Is that true? Do you think Israel is safer today when the U.S. is now backing her regarding Iran, at least publicly, or, yeah?
First of all, I want to compliment the center for getting President Trump to bring forward this announcement 3 days just for the Herzliya conference,
The power of
which
almost.
definitely changed things.
That
Look,
shows
it's
real
too early.
influence.
Yeah, it's too early to speak about victories. One should never speak about victories in diplomacy or policy making. I think it was an important announcement. I'm speaking now for the United States, not for Israel too, because it reestablished American credibility in the Middle East, which had been completely, I would say, devastated under the Obama administration, which we and our Arab neighbors hoped that the Trump administration would reestablish quickly and did not. But this may perhaps be, I would say, a new sign on the road that America, under the present administration, means what it says. Now, the question is, what does it mean? And I would say this is not yet the last act, it's the first act. And to a very large extent, the onus is on the Europeans, who have a chance over the next 90 days to say, okay, we actually agree with all the goals of President Trump. We don't agree with the way to get there. But under these circumstances, because the American administration actually said to the Iranians, you have to do this and this and that, like President Macron spoke in the Congress, but President Macron did not have an implement to force them to do that. With the establishment, with its speech yesterday, the decision of President Trump, he actually said to the Iranians, look, you're going to lose all the benefits, the huge benefits which you had from this agreement, unless you agree to this and this and that, like President Macron said. And I think that's important, and it's important for Israel for the obvious reasons, the actual nuclear thing, but beyond. The nuclear threat is some years perhaps down the road, perhaps. But the immediate threat from Iranian hegemony, from Iranian radicalism, expansionism, now has to take into account that there is probably, hopefully, an American administration who's not going to let things go as it was under the Obama administration.
So, Ambassador Prosor, I want to ask you, I would ask it in a very, I would say, I'll try and do it in a Trump-style way. Is there finally a guy in the White House that understands how to do business in the Middle East, as opposed to an intellectual, aka President Obama, who thought that you could talk and reason within a regime like Iran and then get them to change their path? Here comes a guy that understands business and understands the Middle East. No more will they say in the corridors of Jerusalem, we have naive people in the White House.
So look, Trump is interesting because Trump,
to say the least,
Trump comes in and he basically does, look at what happened to all of us, okay? Trump implements his promises and we say, wow, a politician that basically does what he said he's going to do, and we're all shocked. Look at North Korea. North Korea is an amazing example of a diplomatic colossal failure of 3 administrations. Clinton, Bush, Obama, and here comes Trump and says, little rocket man, I'll do this to you, I'll do that to you. And we're all shocked. Bottom line, he moves the Chinese. And he moves the Chinese for the first time after years. And here it comes, and by the way, as I walked here, this is breaking news, 3 hostages are on the way with Pompeo on the airplane.
So all the diplomats are out of jobs.
No, but what happens is you have something new. And what do you have? You have Trumplomacy. What's Trumplomacy? It's this tweeting element. So I want to get to my people above New York Times or CNN. I talk to them directly. And in addition to that, business-like. I'm, upping the game, and then I compromise. So in the sense, I come in and I say, okay, NATO, horrible organization, why should we pay for it? Everyone says, oh, shocked, fifth article, oy vey. Surprise, surprise, the French, the Germans are paying. The Secretary General of NATO comes over to Trump, good man. And in essence, you also see, and I think it's important for us in the region, you talk to me about the region, look at the Egyptians, happy, they're jumping up and down in Cairo because of Obama. Sisi didn't visit Washington for 3.5 years. The Saudis, of course, because of the Iranian deal, the hegemony. And in Israel, let's face it, this administration sees eye to eye with Israel on 3 strategic issues. 1, on radical Islam and terrorism. 2, on Iran. 3, on Israel as a strategic asset for the US and the region. So in the sense, when you look and you combine all this, yes, it's erratic, it's odd, it's something that it's not diplomatic in a sense, but I can tell you, it seems like on some issues, it's quite effective.
But in a way, I want to ask our American panelists, in a way, the strength of the United States used to be the fact that it was it wasn't Israeli in the way they did business or diplomacy. They had plans and contingency plans, and everything had a strategy. Do you think that is something that has gone away from the strength of the United States? Are we in a new era? And what does it mean for the United States' interests?
I think this president is more Israeli than the Israelis in some respects. I mean, he shocked everyone and defied logic, and defied predictability. But he does have some successes. But that's not to say that the system has changed. We have a national security structure right now that's under a certain amount of flux. We've got a new national security advisor. We're going to have a new head of CIA. We have a brand new head of State Department. So I think the processes in among themselves will probably be very much the same. But what he's injected is an element of unpredictability that
Which is deterrence.
which has actually been exciting. In the case of North Korea.
What Mr. Prosor is saying is that unpredictableness is a deterrence.
Sometimes.
It's a deterrence.
Sometimes.
It can also lead to confusion, which is what I think Turkey, for example, takes advantage of what it perceives as mixed messages from the United States for it to go on its merry way and get away with some activities that in previous regimes maybe would not have been tolerated. But I think so far so good that Trump has been very good with being unpredictable and by force of personality. And maybe it's because people haven't gotten the sense of him yet that he's gotten away with some successes. And good
Look
on
at
him.
Jerusalem, Dana. Jerusalem is a good example, okay? Basically, everyone threatened us, violence all over the Arab world,
Not
3 days
Not
of
everybody.
rage, I was saying to myself, 3 days of rage. I thought that in under 362 days, they're meditating and doing yoga, But in the sense, Jerusalem and standing on his promises, and it's new.
Look, I'll tell you, Ron, you said we have an administration that does what it says. If that's the case, you should be concerned about some things. The president says he's getting out of Syria. How does that relate to countering the Iranians in Syria? What message does that send? The strike that was, the retaliatory strike in response to the chemical weapons that were used in Duma was so narrow, and it came in the aftermath of the Russians saying that they would retaliate. We carried out a strike against 3 targets that were far removed from where the Russians were, but also from where the Iranians were. It sent a very clear message to the Iranians. You listen to the administration talk, including the president, when he's asked about Syria, it's ISIS and ISIS alone.
So you're basically saying that it may look like a totally new, different game, but it's not going to be a different when it comes to putting boots on the ground or
No,
putting
look,
the dollars where the mouth is if and when there will be need for a military action in the region.
The president has made it pretty clear he doesn't want to be in the Middle East. So
how does it play with his pulling out yesterday?
Well, I think the statement yesterday was very comprehensive in terms of what we want to stop the Iranians from doing, with no indication of what we're actually going to do to stop them from doing that. So I think the point here is there is a degree of unpredictability. There is no question a departure. The real question is also, as we like to say, we need to see the proof. Where are going to be the substantive signs of real change? Is the U.S. going to be playing a central role in this region or not? If you ask who's the main address today when it comes to the Middle East, I say it's Moscow. We have the Prime Minister of Israel visiting Putin for the 8th time. We have a king of Saudi Arabia who had never gone to Moscow before, go to Moscow. We have the king of Jordan right after concluding a 5-year assistance deal with the Trump administration, and assistance is not something the president particularly likes, going to Moscow. There is a perception that the Russians are determining the shape of the region. Historically, it was always the United States that was the pivot here. So I think with the Trump administration, in some cases, be careful what you wish for. When he says he's going to do something, Ron, you're right, he tends to do it. Well, he says he wants out of Syria. He does not have today, and maybe this will change. Maybe it'll change with Pompeo as Secretary of State. Maybe it'll change with Bolton as National Security Advisor. But today, it's very hard to point to what the administration is actually doing to counter the Iranians in the region. There's no doubt that Israel, the Saudis, and many others, the Egyptians, they prefer what they see Trump saying to what they heard from President Obama. They saw President Obama wanting to pivot to Asia. They saw President Obama not acting on the red line. They saw President Obama treating Iran as if it was part of the solution to the problems of the region, not the source of the problems of the region. So the language of President Trump is much more pleasing. But I think we have to ask the question, what are the actual policies? I would like to be able to say, we don't know yet. I'm worried that, in fact, we may know.
So if you were asked by officials in Cairo or in Jordan or Riyadh, do you think we should back up with our relations with Moscow now? Can we rely more on the United States? Do you agree with Ambassador Ross that it's too early to say, or that they shouldn't even try?
I think we're talking about slightly two different things. One is the policies of Trump as the president, the way he acts, the way he's injected himself, the way he's introduced unpredictability in order to get credibility in some respects. But you have that clashing a bit with the laws of the Middle East, the laws of influence, the laws of leverage. And in the Middle East, to have leverage, to influence, you have to be on the ground. You have to have a stake in the game, at least in some respects. And right now, the biggest stakeholder from a superpower standpoint, or from a non-regional standpoint, is clearly Russia. Now, how the U.S. decides to leverage that, whether they let Russia take the lead because it wants it, and because it's very important domestically for Russia to have that lead, is still undetermined. I can see the U.S. allowing Russia and feeding that, frankly, and allowing Russia to have certain successes in the region in order to influence Russia to use whatever leverage it has against Iran and to keep Iran contained or not doing certain things. So I think it's too early to tell. I know that's a hateful answer, but I do think that the message is clear from the president to Egypt and everyone else that don't put all your eggs in one basket, because at the end of the day, outsiders like Russia, particularly given its other economic and demographic problems, are not going to be in the Middle East long term in the way that the U.S. has at least been historically. Now, whether the U.S. will return to a historic role, I think, is very much still in question.
Ambassador Shoval, Amos Gilad earlier today in the conference said that he's worried that after the celebrations and the declarations and whatever, at the end of the day, Israel will find itself alone, maybe with the United States, but against the rest of the world when it comes to Iran.
Well, it doesn't look like that. Actually, Israel's international relations under the present government, under the present prime minister, have expanded without precedent. And I think Israel's working relationship, not ideological, but working relationship with Russia is a proof of that. Now, this is not an easy concern for Israel, because we can never replace our relationship with the United States for all the different reasons which we know with anybody else. But because Obama opened the door to the Russians and to the Iranians to the Middle East, and Trump, unfortunately, till now didn't close it, Israel has to play a very careful, well thought out strategy. On the one hand, cooperate with the Russians on local issues. And local issues includes, of course, Syria, which is approaching and which is a crucial issue at this present time. But not to forget that our basic relationship must be and will continue to be with the United States. Now, the question really is, as Dennis mentioned and raised, does the administration, after a very important act together, yesterday I think a positive act for different reasons, will it pursue that? Will it pursue a real policy to the Middle East? And that's a big question mark for Israel.
Does it have a real policy in the Middle East?
I'm sorry?
Does it have a real policy in the
Well,
Middle East?
that is my question. Does the act of yesterday,
I ask
important as
questions.
it is, will
You're
that
supposed to
be
be
a
providing the
sign?
answers.
Will that be a sign of actually
Well,
adopting
let me ask it
a
differently.
policy? And
Not yet.
I'd like to add just one sentence to that. Look, there's a debate among political scientists whether the situation in the Middle East is chaos or just a mere anarchy. Okay, take your choice. But that is the situation that Israel faces. We can't say, like we used to say in the past, okay, America will protect us and this, that. We have to play our own game. And we hope that America will establish, I'm saying will, doesn't at the present time, which will make it very clear that one act decisions, like this decision yesterday, is not policy. We want to see more. And unless we do that, the Russians, by the way, will strengthen their position as well.
Ron, from the international perspective, it's quite sure that the United States has chosen to ally with Israel and the Sunni states and push away. I mean, Macron went out of his way to give Trump the right treatment, to do whatever he can to make Trump feel good, and he was pushed away. Not to talk about Merkel or May after they came along his coalition in Syria. What does it do to the United States in the international arena, this clear siding with Israel and the Sunni states and pushing away which would be their natural allies?
It's not just Israel, it's basically the U.S. going back to the allies in the past. So it's, Saudi Arabia. It's transactional in the way he thinks, but it's not just Israel. It's returning to a different policy. And when you look at the decision on Iran yesterday, the interesting part is that the messaging is going to a differentiation between the European governments, Dana, and the European multinational companies that would basically have to make a choice between the US market and the Iranian market. And I know, because of the difference in commerce, that they will choose the United States. The governments will not have a say so much on their decision. So by doing that, he's really pushing that direction on sanctions on Iran to create change. Now, look, the U.S. also conveys something that I would call it leadership. I was at the United Nations, the nations which are not united on anything, but they were united looking at Obama as the president, where the U.S., the U.S. leadership position really, really eroded. The British ambassador, only a British ambassador can define it so nice. Say, the allies of the United States do not respect it, and its enemies are not afraid of it. So in the sense, I think this is returning to some respectability with a caution, because no one really knows what he thinks or what he was going to do next. So the U.S., in the sense, under this leadership, I think conveys, like Zalman said, it's organized chaos, and like I said, a bit of, people are afraid. They're not sure what's going to happen next.
But Mary Beth, sorry, is this indeed the role you see the United States should play? I mean, changing its allies? Is it indeed changing its allies, pushing away its natural allies? Will it gain its strength by doing so?
2 points. The fact of mere change, if, for example, our policy in North Korea, I want to broaden this just a bit, hadn't changed in 40 years, and we couldn't figure out why the North Koreans wouldn't come to the table with serious concessions. We were in a cycle. Trump broke that cycle. So I think to the extent that the president believes that doing something unexpected, something new, breaks the cycle and brings opportunity with that, I think he'll do it. I think our alliances worldwide are a lot stronger than we're all pretending they are today. The fact of the matter is, post-World War II, our European alliances, we've gone up and down. We've gone through the Iraq issue together. We've gone through a lot of the Vietnam War. We'll be fine. I mean, there are levels of our relationship, and while this is a big degree of difference, when it comes to Russia and other things, our alliances are solid, and certainly the transatlantic alliance is solid.
Ambassador Ross, what would you want to see in the region to come and say, well, Israel, the United States has indeed changed its position, it's coming back, it's taking a more concrete role? What would be the signs of that?
Well,
Do you
I'll
think,
give you-
first of all, do you think it should come back and take a more concrete role, or you think pulling out is the right strategy for the United States?
I would say, I'll put this in a broader frame and then I'll become more specific. If there's one thing that nature abhors, it's a vacuum. In the Middle East, whenever there's a vacuum, the worst possible forces fill it. Now, in Iraq, we created the vacuum by removing Saddam Hussein, and we didn't know what was going to replace it. We thought we did, but we didn't know, and the worst forces replaced it. In Syria, President Obama, precisely because the Iraq example was so prominent in his head, every time he looked at Syria, he saw Iraq, so he stayed away from it. That contributed to a vacuum, and the worst forces filled it. In Syria today, because we didn't play a role, and that was true, frankly, in the last administration, and it's been true in this administration as well. Russia, Iran, Turkey, all very prominent. So this is an indirect way of answering your question. We need to be the significant, dominant outside power in this region to prevent vacuums from forming. When the Russians are playing the role they're playing, it's not a stabilizing role. The Russians have been abetting Iranian power in Syria. It is Russian air power and air cover that has allowed the Shia militias to expand. That is a threat to Israel. The Russians are playing that role. The U.S. should be playing the role it did traditionally. I'll give you a perfect example historically. In September 1970, Black September 1970, so the Syrians send 300 tanks across the border into Jordan. The United States at that time is tied down in Cambodia. And what does the Nixon administration do? It goes to the Israelis, comes to the Israelis and says, we need you to mobilize your forces in the Golan either to stop the Syrians or deter the Syrians. The Israelis say, we'll do it, but you have to handle the Soviets. Now, the same lesson is there today. We need to be exerting leverage on the Russians to get the Russians to contain the further spread of Iran. If we don't do that, unquestionably, there is a collision course. The Israeli position is Iran cannot be allowed to recreate in Syria what it has created in Lebanon. And Iran seems quite determined to create precisely that. Now, either the Russians have to contain them, which they are not doing, or, in a sense, we leave it entirely up to Israel. The problem there is you know how a war between Israel and Iran starts. You do not know how it ends. And the fact is, the Iranians may think they have a special leverage, an asymmetric advantage over Israel, because they can threaten them from Lebanon and from Syria, and Iran's far away. Well, it's not in Israel's DNA to allow them to be able to orchestrate a war against Israel from a distance and be untouched. So when Israel decides to strike Iran, what does Iran do? My guess, by the way, is they can't do more than what they're doing through Hezbollah and the other Shia militias in launching rockets from Lebanon and Syria, so they probably hit the Saudis. So then you have an expansion. Then the U.S. is going to be drawn in under worse circumstances and with fewer options. So it goes back to the heart of your question. The U.S. needs to play a significant role in the region from the standpoint of America's interests, which also then serves the interests of America's allies in the region, including especially Israel.
And that's an interesting point because Trump makes a point of doing everything opposite than President Obama, except in the fact that he doesn't want to put, he doesn't want to invest in the Middle East. That's one thing he doesn't care Obama and him see eye to eye.
Look, there is no question there is a wariness and a weariness within the American public about being drawn into Middle Eastern conflicts. It's completely understandable. The problem is if you do the exact opposite, then what you do is then you contribute to that vacuum that ends up sucking us in worse circumstances with worse options where we end up paying a higher price. I understand the desire for us to work with local partners. It's logical. But if we aren't there as well, they're not going to play that role. The only country that will play that role is Israel, because Israel has the means and it is determined and it sees the threat. But the expectation that, for example, we'll get the Arab states to come in and take our place in Syria, that's an illusion.
Maybe Ron Prosor, that's the reason why Israel and especially the Netanyahu administration are so glad, I would say, with this, or satisfied with this pullout from the deal, because they see maybe 2 or 3 steps ahead, and they understand that is the way to get the United States and get Trump invested in the Middle East, despite his, intentions.
Look, I think
It's a win-win for Israel in that case. We're saying either we get, a deal, or we have the back of the United States. Or would be wise to think that way?
What is really interesting is that the dialogue between Netanyahu, the Israeli administration, and the American administration is really, really close. You can see that coordination.
That's an understatement.
No, that coordination is something that, I don't have to, Dennis is here and Zalman, my former boss, I tell a story, Zalman.
You were very good.
Zalman always told me before we went to meet Dennis and Aaron at SMAC, he used to tell, I said, okay, Zalman, what do we really have to achieve here? He said, Ron, we have to achieve that they will not really know how much we don't know, this relationship. It was really, so we are back in that intimate relationship where we can talk, we can coordinate, and we keep things to ourselves. And you can really see that. You don't really have to be a psychiatrist.
Sherlock Holmes. You don't have to be Sherlock
to
Holmes.
really see that. And that's really strategically important for how we operate in the region, and everyone else, and that's important, the perception also see it.
Zalman, you didn't answer my question, but okay.
Well, I'll give you my answer first, then you put your question. Look, I'm just theorizing, but I could imagine a situation.
You just have to, if you could, yeah.
Sorry? Okay. I can imagine a situation where Israel would have to say to our American friends, look, we may be forced to take some sort of proactive, serious military steps in order to protect ourselves. I mean, President Macron said there's no planet B. Israel doesn't have a country B.
Right.
So then this would mean that America, which basically, whatever administration, wants to recreate some sort of stability, will have to look after its own interests in taking a more active role in the Middle East, hopefully, by the way, together with Russia, which is also interested in stability, a different sort of stability. But there may be a common denominator, even with regards to the present regime in Syria. There may be common denominators, and that, of course, means that America has to be actively engaged also for the Russians to consider. Otherwise, nobody else will.
Can I just add a point?
Sure.
Zalman, the key to getting the Russians
By
to
the way, I just have to ask, did they manage to trick you? I mean, you didn't know how much they didn't know? That was okay?
I always knew they knew much more than they said. The key to getting the Russians to be responsive is for them to fear the consequences of not cooperating with us. Today they don't. So, and when we send the signal we're getting out, that gives them less of a reason to be responsive.
I couldn't agree more.
Well,
I
it's not-
couldn't agree
it's-
more.
It's not only that we send the signal we are getting out, we sent the signal collectively that we are not willing to kill Russians or Iranians while we're there on our way out. Can I just inject something? I find it a little disturbing that we're having this conversation and no one's brought up the reality that it will probably happen, which is this will muddle on for some indefinite period of time while everyone sorts themselves out. Meanwhile, you've got growing Shia militia in Iraq that are knocking on the door of Saudi Arabia. You've got a Saudi Arabia that is in tremendous turmoil and in a very good sense, but tremendous domestic pressure as it moves very rapidly through a total reform of its social structure. You've got Saudi Arabia very worried about what's coming across the border in Yemen. You've got Egypt with a demographic implosion that's going to happen in the next decade, with water and economic problems that are not being addressed, and an increasingly authoritarian regime. Right now, Egypt has a tremendous ally in Egypt. When we go from approximately 90 million Egyptians to 120 plus million Egyptians in very short order, most of them uneducated and worried about water, I worry that like always, we focus on one part of the Middle East, and then the part that we'd forgotten about because we were so busy over here comes violently to the fore, and we all go, oh, we should have seen that coming. And we haven't really discussed any of that today, but all of this is going to have to be part of a U.S. Middle East strategy.
We hope
Sorry.
there will be a U.S. but we have. I mean, I think it's amazing that we have had a discussion about the U.S. Role in the Middle East and not brought up yet what we used to be on top of the list, and that would be the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Ambassador Ross, as you have so much experience in that field, do you think the United States has lost its position as a fair negotiator after the Jerusalem Declaration and given the close coordination between Israel and the United States?
You know, the U.S. for a very long period of time has been described as not being an honest broker. In early 2005, I went to Gaza before Israel had withdrawn, and I spoke to a couple hundred Palestinians, and one of the things I was emphasizing was that this was a real opportunity for the Palestinians to shape their own future. In '48, they hadn't been able to do it. When we were at Camp David, Arafat said to me that he would have gone to the original Camp David if it wasn't for the Soviets and the Syrians. So I said, all right, here, Israel's getting out. You turn Gaza into a going concern, and you'll shape your future, because the Israelis will say, okay, if it works there, then it can work in the West Bank. But if you turn it into a platform for attacks, who's going to say, let's take that failed model and apply it elsewhere? So their response to me was not to respond on the substance of what I said, but say, the U.S. can't be an honest broker. And I responded by saying, you know, for the last 4 years, during the first term of the Bush administration, they had walked away from this issue. So I said, the U.S. hasn't been a broker at all. Can anybody here say you're better off? Now, this was an audience that had no problem complaining about the United States, and they weren't shy. Not one hand went up. This was 2005. We were still feeling the effects of the Second Intifada. And so I said, look, the only reason that the U.S. hasn't played a role is because President Bush said, look, if Clinton couldn't do it, I'm not going to do it. We didn't prevent the Europeans from coming in and playing the role. We didn't prevent the Russians from coming in and playing the role. They didn't because they couldn't. The U.S. is still the only one that can play that role. I know where the Palestinians are. I know how Abu Mazen has complained. I also saw his last speech, which was filled with anti-Semitic tropes. The fact of the matter is, if the United States presents a serious approach, then almost by definition, it plays the role. If it doesn't present a serious approach, okay. But I don't think anybody can take the place of the United States, and the best indication of that is in the past, when the U.S. was prepared to check out, nobody did.
So I just want to finalize this panel by asking you, would you hold your breath with all the years of experience that we have on stage, that this president will surprise us once more, maybe not surprise us, and be the one to do the impossible and get the sides to sign an ultimate deal?
Want me to start?
We'll finish with you. Let's start with Zalman, yeah. I'm sorry I'm looking at my phone, but it's already almost 8, and the Prime Minister is coming back from Russia, so I have to report about it. And I'm on stage. Okay, yeah.
That makes it hard.
Okay, I'll try. I was never terribly happy with the term honest broker, because how can you be an honest broker between the good guys and the bad guys? But I fully agree with Dennis. There's no other power which can have an effective influence on developments. Even if America didn't start any of those big things, neither the peace treaty with Egypt, nor Oslo, for whatever it's worth, and so on and so forth. But the only one who can bring it to the finish is the United States. And as someone said before, I think, was Dennis, there's no vacuum in the Middle East. If it won't be the United States, well, we can imagine who it will be. And that will certainly be less positive from Israel's point of view. But having said that, to your direct question, and I repeat what I said on this speech, on this stage exactly a year ago. I don't know what the plans of President Trump are, if he has any, with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I don't think that there's any possibility in the near future to reach any sort of formula of a real, final, definite peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It doesn't have the increments which are needed for a real peace. The Palestinians have not yet recognized the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own. They will not abandon the right of return. I'm not even talking about Jerusalem, which is less important, I think.
Oh, sorry.
And therefore, as long
you're
as
not
this
holding your
condition exists, we can at best hope for interim agreements, for all sorts of management agreements, which are good in order to stop violence. But it won't be the sort of peace on the White House lawn, which wasn't peace either.
Okay, in short, I always thought that the Palestinians could not really do the heavy lifting that is needed to really reach a comprehensive agreement without the Arab countries. Hence, we need the Arab countries, the regional element, to really help them do the heavy lifting of elements. Take Jerusalem, for example. The custodians of the holy places, the monarchies, Jordanians, Egyptians, Moroccans, say, who is Abu Mazen to decide Jerusalem for the Muslim world? And I can go on. So bottom line, without the region, the Palestinians can't do the heavy lifting by themselves, and Trump might surprise with a regional approach. So I am holding my breath.
I'll defer to Dennis, who knows more about the U.S. role. I actually agree with my colleague, and perhaps I'm overreading signals, but Khalid bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia's recent public statement that drew Palestinian criticism, by the way, about the Palestinians getting to the table and looking seriously at serious deals, I thought did not come out of the blue. I also noticed yesterday or today there were Palestinian criticisms of Emirati and Bahraini participants in the most recent Israeli bicycle race in Jerusalem. That didn't come out of the blue. So perhaps I'm reading the tea leaves too strongly, but I think there are indications, inshallah, that at the very beginning of the negotiations, the Arab states were very involved way back in time. And perhaps we're going full cycle where there are indications of Arab regional support behind the scenes or participation. But I'm encouraged.
Dennis, we'll leave you with the final word, and I think we're going to listen very closely to what you're saying, because we know that you have the ear of this administration, certainly when it comes to these issues.
I wouldn't exaggerate
Deny
that.
it immediately, then.
I would not exaggerate that.
He didn't deny, he said don't exaggerate. I think that's a signal.
No, I mean, look, I do think this. I think the administration on this issue is making a serious, thoughtful effort. Whether it can produce the ultimate deal, I have more doubts about that. I think, there is a need to bring the Arabs in, and there is no question there's an evolution taking place in terms of Arab attitudes. I don't know the evolution has gone far enough so that they will publicly adopt a position that is counter to the Palestinians. Historically, they've not been willing to do that, and I'm not sure they're there yet as well. So, you know, if all the stars were to be aligned, you would need to have the Arab states be prepared to assume a kind of public responsibility for the Palestinians. We're not really there yet. For them to do that, I think you probably need two things. They would need, one, from the administration, an unmistakable demonstration that the administration is dealing with the threats they feel most, not just rhetorically, but practically, and we're not there yet. Secondly, they would have to look at the plan and feel that the plan was credible enough and defensible from their standpoint so they could say they're delivering for the Palestinians what they can't deliver for themselves. And again, I don't know if we're going to be there yet on that either. Even if all those things aligned, you'd still have one other basic problem. Nobody has an answer for Hamas in Gaza. And that means even if you could put together the right deal, you can't implement it. So I would like us to be in a position where we also focus on how we build things from the ground up, manage things so we create the circumstances where all those stars align. I don't think they're quite there yet, but I want to be fair to the administration. I think the nature of their approach is a thoughtful and a serious one. I just think the context makes it difficult to succeed.
So there's a mission that even President Trump in his disorderly manner can overcome, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thanks for that news. And I want to say that as we were speaking here, the president went ahead and said that if the Iranians don't come back to the table, then he will strike and he will take action. So this is the latest from the President Trump just as we speak. So I think we'll have to meet again in a couple of months or maybe next year to see what that meant. In the meanwhile, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and sharing with us your thoughts and your insight. And thank you so much for having me and a successful Congress ahead.
I see.